Shalom, I'm Brother Rael from Reunited Soul, and in this video, I'm going to discuss the relationship between David and Jonathan of the TANAKH, or the Old Testament scriptures, from a righteous perspective. If you observe it from a view of carnality, and without the proper scriptural context, your view of this relationship can simply be perverted. Now, this discussion is in response to TruthUnveiled777, a YouTube channel whose video is titled The Truth About Homosexuality. So, let us nourish our soul with scripture that we may reunite with the Most High, the Elohim of Yisrael. All scriptures will be read verbatim from the King James Version Bible. Now let's get right into it. Much love to the family. In these uncertain times we find ourselves in, place your trust in the Most High. As we witness with our eyes His mighty power and glory working on the behalf of His people's deliverance. Get your household in order, that the peace of the Most High and His provisions may be upon it, regardless of the chaos and devastation coming upon the nations. Put your trust in the Most High and tend to your house, as did our ancestors while enduring the 10 plagues of Egypt. Now, with that being said, I do find it quite disheartening that those of us who worship the Most High and Him alone have to suffer New Testament believers misinterpreting the Tanakh or the Old Testament scriptures to satisfy their messianic conclusions, or in this case, carnal conclusions. Nevertheless, let us take on this endeavor for the love of our people and to the glory of the Most High. Now, for a little background on this discussion. TruthUnveiled777 has put out a controversial 3-hour video about the 144,000 of the New Testament being men who don't desire women, and the insinuation that the relationship of David and Jonathan of the Tanakh or Old Testament scripture was sexual in nature. Yes, you heard me correctly. A 3-hour video from a carnal perspective. The brother also did a 32-minute follow-up video afterwards. So, quite a bit was discussed on these two topics. Now, to be honest, I did not watch the full 3 hours of the brother's presentation. It was quite painful to watch due to the fact that he was speaking of our beloved King David in such a way. And it is not wise to give a rebuke to someone without fully weighing the content of their presentation. So, the goal of my discussion is not to rebuke our brother's video, but to correctly put into context the relationship of David and Jonathan in its proper righteous perspective. Now, my previous discussion that I posted was about the 144,000 of the New Testament. And that was before I came across this brother's 3-hour video. And you already know where I stand with the fallacy of the 144,000. If you have not watched my video discussion titled Investigating the 144,000, I encourage you to do so. So, for the sake of time, this discussion would just be about David and Jonathan's relationship. To be clear, TruthUnveiled777 is not the first to have this carnal view of David and Jonathan having some kind of sexual relationship or sexual attraction towards one another. This idea has been thrown around long before him and will continue long after him. And he's getting the predictable backlash from the divided New Testament community. Let's be very clear. New Testament believers have no boundaries as to the many ways that they interpret Scripture. Now, getting back to David and Jonathan. It is very clear in Scripture that Jonathan loved David greatly, and there is nothing in Scripture that would have us to believe that the feelings David had for Jonathan was not mutual. They both simply loved one another. I will, through Scripture, Simply put that love in its proper righteous perspective. And the good news to you is, it won't take me 3 hours and a 30-minute follow-up to do it. A word to the wise should be sufficient. So, in order to prevent anyone believing that David possibly experimented with same-sex activities before becoming king, we must understand that the Spirit of the Most High came upon David before establishing a relationship with Jonathan, who happened to be the son of King Saul. As a matter of fact, the Spirit of the Most High was upon David before he fought Goliath. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 11 through 14. And I read, And Samuel said unto Jesse, Are here all thy children? And he said, There remaineth yet the youngest, and behold, he keepeth the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, Send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he come hither. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and withal of beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil, and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose and went to Ramah. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. So as you can see, the Spirit of the Most High was with David at a tender young age. You can also see that the Spirit of the Most High departed from Saul, which will eventually bring David into Saul's continued presence. Let's go to it. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 21 through 23. And I read, And David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. So in verse 21, since David loved Saul greatly, are we to believe as well that something sexually was going on between them? No, not at all. David loved and respected Saul as the anointed king of Yisrael, and would not lay a hand to harm the Most High's anointed, even after Saul was hell-bent on killing David. So, if David loved King Saul and was loyal to him to the very end, would it be difficult to understand why Jonathan, the son of Saul, would have such a strong love for David? This was not some mere carnal attraction or lust at first sight that Jonathan had with David. Not difficult at all to understand. Now, before we get to the scriptures in question, we must get the proper context to the event that took place prior. And this would be right after David slew Goliath, according to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 57 through 58. And I read, And as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son art thou, thou young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. We must understand, with the slaying of Goliath, King Saul's army found the courage to give chase to the fleeing Philistines. And with that context, we can have a better understanding of what transpired next between David and Jonathan. Let's go straight to the scriptures that our brother, TruthUnveiled777, 3-hour video used to justify this love between David and Jonathan as a physical attraction or sexual in nature. And yes, I am intentionally avoiding the use of certain buzzwords that set people off. I am not looking to turn this moment of clarity into a lifestyle, political, or us versus them discussion. I will intentionally keep it scriptural, as always, for the sake of simplicity. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, and I read. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, and would let him go no more home to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him, and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servant. Now, some may have pictured a butt-naked Jonathan bearing all his vulnerabilities to David. I wonder how many were disappointed to find that verse 5 did not provide the juicy details of a hot, steamy romance between David and Jonathan. Instead, it continued on with the business at hand, which was the battle with the Philistines. So, what was Jonathan doing in verse 4 if he was not propositioning David, stripping down in front of David as he did? Now, keeping in mind that we already know what a carnal mind would think. With that said, let's go ahead and view it from a righteous perspective. First, we must understand the situation at hand. Goliath was defying the armies of Yisrael by challenging any man to come and fight him. This had a demoralizing effect because no man came forward until David volunteered and slew Goliath, which caused the Philistines to flee, and the army of Yisrael found their courage and pursued. Let's revisit 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1. As David, who was already anointed by the prophet Samuel, was speaking with King Saul, it said that Jonathan's soul was knit with the soul of David. And for what reason? Because Jonathan was King Saul's son, and heir to the throne. However, the Most High had different plans for the throne, as he had chosen David to replace Saul as king, which would have made Jonathan and David's adversaries for the throne that could easily have led to an untimely death. Instead, Jonathan's soul became knit with David's soul, which gave them that unbreakable bond towards one another, which also puts Jonathan in agreement with the will of the Most High, which was making David the next king of Yisrael. Now, we can put verse 4 in its proper context. Also, looking from a military perspective, because they were still in process of battling the Philistines, as Jonathan stripped himself of his robe, which represents title and status of being the king's son, and gave it to David. Why? This was a symbolic act from Jonathan to let David know that he was not going to stand in the way of destiny. He then continued on with his garment, sword, bow, and girdle in a symbolic act of loyalty to David's new military role in the kingdom. We can see the proof of that in verse 5, as King Saul places David over the men of war. We must understand that without the Most High's knitting their souls, David and Jonathan would have been in hostile competition for the throne, as well as leading the armies of Yisrael. And we can see an example of this as King Saul began to see David as a threat to his throne. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 6 through 9, and I read. And it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day and forward. So we can clearly see that Saul's and David's relationship turned hostile early on because of the spirit that was upon Saul. However, David remained faithful to Saul, and likewise, Jonathan remained faithful to the covenant made with David. And another important fact to remember, that in times of war, when death surrounds you and life is uncertain, strong bonds are made between those who must endure the hardships and sacrifices of war. There comes a closeness that cannot be obtained otherwise, as you depend on one another's loyalty and courage for day-to-day survival. So, to reduce such a bond between David and Jonathan as some kind of sexual relationship is to bring dishonor to the very nature of that bond. The brother from TruthUnveiled777 used another scripture to justify his belief that David and Jonathan were lovers when David stated that their love surpassed that of women. We know how a carnal mind would interpret this, but again, we can put it in its proper context by knowing David and Jonathan were warriors and at times surrounded by death and destruction. In this case, Jonathan died in battle, and David was expressing his love for Jonathan according to 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 25 through 27. And I read, How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? So as you can see, not only were David and Jonathan kinsmen, they were brothers of war. An extremely close brotherhood that can only be forged in times of war, when life is uncertain and a brother is willing to lay down his life for another brother. The context is war and the inevitability of the lives it will shatter. A war that eventually took Jonathan's life, and how David chose to describe his love for Jonathan as passing the love of women in verse 26. Now, when placed in the proper context of brothers of war, we can better understand the nature of David's statement. And we can also look at the fact that both David and Jonathan bore sons, which proves both sought natural relations with women. Allow me to close with the proof of Jonathan's son and King David protecting him when the Gibeonites sought justice for what King Saul had done to them, which required the seed of King Saul to pay that blood debt with their lives. Let's go to 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 3 through 7, and I read, Wherefore David said unto the Gibeonites, What shall I do for you? And wherewith shall I make the atonement, that ye may bless the inheritance of the Lord? And the Gibeonites said unto him, We shall have no silver nor gold of Saul, nor of his house, neither for us shalt thou kill any man in Israel. And he said, What ye shall say, that will I do for you. And they answered the king, The man that consumed us, and that devised against us, that we should be destroyed from remaining in any of the coasts of Israel. Let 7 men of his sons be delivered unto us, and we will hang them up unto the Lord in Gibeah for Saul, whom the Lord did choose. And the king said, I will give them. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. As you can see in verse 7, Jonathan had a son which King David remained faithful to the covenant made with Jonathan by protecting his son. Also in verse 7, notice how it states the Lord's oath that was between David and Jonathan. In other words, this was not some agreement made between 2 young men in the heat of lustful passion. No, not at all. This was a righteous covenant between 2 mighty men of the Most High. And to think otherwise exposes your heart's true intent. TruthUnveiled777 actually sounds like a very intelligent brother. However, we must be very careful on our journey for the truth. We cannot confuse intelligence with righteousness. Let me repeat that. We cannot confuse intelligence with righteousness. In other words, you can be the most intelligent person in the world with no discernment for the matters regarding the Most High and His people. Now, I will leave you with words of wisdom according to Proverbs, chapter 3, verses 5 through 7. And I read, Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thy own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes. Fear the Lord, and depart from evil. But that being said, always keep your trust in the Most High. Love him with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. See to it that your household is in line with the word of the Most High as best you can. I thank you for taking the time to watch. Again, I am Rael, your reunited soul brother. And with that, I say to you, Shalom.